Welcome to Serious Rock Talk Crime.
How does a man disappear for 6 months and learn to play the guitar to the point where he becomes one of the most influential guitarists in the history of American blues, and by extension, rock and roll? How does he emerge from those lost 6 months and begin to write some of the most influential blues songs ever? Because that's what Robert Johnson did. And his accomplishments were so surprising that some people, attribute it all to supernatural forces that came to collect him at the age of only 27. Robert Johnson, king of the Delta Blues and founder of the infamous 27 Club. Hello, my name is Dr. Ian Clarke, and you are listening to Serious Rock Talk Crime. And today we're going back further than we ever have before. Back to 1911, because that's when it all began for Robert Johnson. The following is partially based on an article by Brandon Stoner found at guitar.com. This is a tale of talent, tragedy, and deep, deep mystery. Details about Johnson's birth are scarce. He was born Robert Leroy Johnson sometime in May 1911. In Hazelhurst, Mississippi. His mother, Julia Dodds, was married to a man by the name of Charles Dodds, with whom she had 10 other children. However, Dodds was not Robert's father. In the years prior to Johnson's birth, Dodds had been forced to flee Mississippi from Memphis by a lynch mob, changing his surname to Spencer and leaving his wife behind. Julia took up with a man named Noah Johnson. The pair never married, but the relationship would produce a son, Robert. When Robert was still a young child, Julia and Charles reconciled, and for a brief time lived together with their various children in Memphis. But it wasn't to last, and eventually Julia would return to Mississippi and marry a man named Dusty Willis, who was 24 years her junior. I mention this because Johnson used many names over the years. During the course of his brief life, he would go by the surnames Johnson, Dodds, Moore, James, and Barstow. By the time he was 13, after finally learning his father's identity, he officially changed his name to Robert Johnson. In 1929, he married 16-year-old Virginia Travis and signed the register using his father's surname. Not long after, Virginia became pregnant, and wanting to provide a stable life for his family, he took a job on a plantation. But tragedy came. Virginia and the baby died in childbirth. Later, some of Virginia's relatives believed that their deaths were punishment for Robert singing secular songs, the blues. The dark cloud begins to form. The accusation that something was wrong between Johnson and God would follow him through other doomed relationships, and before long, he came to believe it himself. Alright, Johnson had always loved music, and by this point in his life, it was the only thing that brought him joy. He became proficient at jaw harp and harmonica. He was inspired by rowdy country blues artists like Son House and Charlie Patton, and studied them performing at juke joints and bars around the South. He wanted to leave the plantation and create music. Robert knew that if he wanted to make a name for himself, he needed to play the guitar. And in a stroke of luck, Son House had relocated to Robinsonville, where Robert lived, and Johnson begged House into letting him learn. The problem was, Johnson might have been a good harmonica player, but he was an awful guitarist. In fact, Son House would later recall the time when he was watching the younger man play one night and an audience member leant over and said to Son House, "Why don't you go out and make that boy put that thing down?" Obviously, practice was required, and lots of it. Now, here comes the big mystery about Robert Johnson, the one that forms the basis of many songs and films. One day Johnson just vanished. Most people assumed he moved to Arkansas or Memphis, but nobody knew for sure. It's speculation. All they knew was that 6 months later he suddenly reappeared in Mississippi, and something had changed, quite dramatically. Where once he'd been a terrible guitar player and an average singer, he was now the talk of the nascent blues scene. He could play guitar and sing better than most others. How did it happen? As was often the case with Robert's life, it didn't take long for the dark rumors to begin. But these ones would define his legacy forever. Mississippi Delta folklore says that if you go down to the crossroads of Highway 61 and 49 in Clarksdale, and when the clock strikes midnight, a person could sell their soul to the devil for fame and fortune. The Faustian tale of a man making a pact with the devil is a recurring motif in Christian mythology. It often seeped into music. 2 centuries ago, people believed the Italian violinist Paganini's powers were satanic. But none of these myths have proved quite as enduring as that of those surrounding Robert Johnson. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread across the blues scene that Johnson had done exactly that. It could be the only explanation. Son House remained convinced this was what happened long after Johnson's death. House said, "He was so good. When he finished, all our mouths were standing open. I said, 'Well, ain't that fast? He's gone now.'" Importantly, Johnson never denied it. He seemed more than happy to not let the truth get in the way of a good story, especially one that was building his fame and reputation. He would even reference the legend in his songs, writing songs like Crossroads Blues, Me and the Devil Blues, Hellhound on My Tail, to further play up his bad reputation. Let's put it in perspective. Johnson wasn't the first Delta musician to be accused of making a deal with the devil for his skills. Another Mississippi bluesman, Tommy Johnson, also claimed to have sold his soul. And then there's Ike Zimmerman. Zimmerman was a renowned blues guitarist who lived in Arkansas and was such an exceptional player that it was believed he visited graveyards at midnight to learn guitar from the spirits who lived there. In truth, Zimmerman is much more likely to be the source of Johnson's rapid improvement than a supernatural component. It is known that Johnson lived with Zimmerman's family. One of Zimmerman's daughters later claimed, "Robert Johnson asked my daddy to teach him how to play guitar, and my daddy taught him. He lived there with my daddy. He stayed a long time." Now, that's a possible explanation. Johnson could have been an extremely talented guitarist. He just needed to study technique, which often doesn't come naturally. While Johnson was now a celebrated blues musician, it was clear to friends that he was running from something. Was it the law, a woman, the devil? While Johnson tried to settle down a few times, having a child with one woman and even marrying another, a woman named Coletta Craft, in 1931, he could never resist the lure of the road. Though he was friendly and entertaining, he never shied from living up to his legend. And he had a dark side. He was moody and drank a lot, and often disappeared for weeks at a time. Alcohol wasn't the only thing he pursued. He was known as a ladies' man, eventually building an entire network of girlfriends, some married, throughout the South. But he was also a mentor, inspiring the likes of Muddy Waters, and he would even teach one of his many girlfriends' kids to play the guitar. He even nicknamed him Robert Jr., and Jr. would go on to play with artists like Sonny Boy Williamson II and Elmore James. By 1936, Johnson was ready to lay his songs on vinyl. Through an acquaintance, he met an upstart producer named Don Law, who would go on to work with Columbia Records and produce other legends like Johnny Cash and Carl Smith. Johnson traveled to San Antonio, Texas in November, where Law had a makeshift studio set up in a hotel room. Over 3 days, Johnson recorded 16 songs, including Crossroads Blues and Sweet Home Chicago, blues standards today. This became among the most significant albums in blues history. His songs were released on various small labels, and one cut from the San Antonio sessions, Terrapin Blues, was a minor hit in the South and funded his second and final recording session. Johnson's recordings were unusually complex for the time. Most early Delta blues musicians played simple guitar figures that harmonized with their voices, but Johnson, imitating the boogie-woogie style of piano playing, used his guitar to play rhythm, bass, and slide simultaneously, all the while singing. Johnson met up with Law again in 1937, this time in Dallas. Unlike other Delta musicians, Johnson was insistent on fitting a song into the 3 minutes of playtime on the side of a 78 RPM record. Johnson only recorded 29 songs in his lifetime. Okay, they say the devil always collects his debts. As with so many things about Johnson's life, the circumstances of his death are mired in speculation, rumor, and darkness. What we do know is that on August 15, 1938, Johnson played his final gig at a country dance in a town outside of Greenwood, Mississippi. 3 days later, he would be dead. Officially, the coroner's report listed Johnson's cause of death as syphilis, though no autopsy was performed. But there's another more sensational tale that has also gained a lot of mileage, that Johnson was killed after drinking a poisoned bottle of whiskey. Some further embellish the tale that the whiskey was poisoned by the cuckolded husband of one of the women that Johnson charmed. Others think his death was a direct result of his well-documented alcohol abuse. When he died, Johnson had no possessions or will, just his guitar. But even details about that are lost to history. Some say that Johnson's guitar was shipped back to his mother after his death, and that it was later pawned when they needed money, but it's never been confirmed. Like so many details of his life, all we have is speculation. What he did leave behind was a small but extraordinarily influential catalog of recorded music, from Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, and Jimi Hendrix, to Jack White and John Mayer. Guitarists of almost every stripe have continued to find a creative spark in Robert Johnson's music. Clapton has called him the most important blues musician in history. In many ways, his nomadic life of music and excess was the blueprint for what would become the rock star stereotype. Johnson was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, and there are multiple sites that claim to be his final resting place. Nobody knows for sure. Some stories say he's buried under a pecan tree, and a cenotaph in his honor resides at Mount Zion Baptist Church, near Money, Mississippi. So what do we have? Well, we have a man who can't sing or play the guitar very well, who goes away somewhere for 6 months, returns, and miraculously can play better than most anyone else, and sing better than almost anyone else, and write amazing songs. And we have a man who dies under extremely suspicious circumstances. Most likely he died from poisoning, intentional or not. And nobody knows where he's buried. I mean, you can see how there's a very dark Gothic feel to the life of Robert Johnson, that things were never going to turn out well for him. And in a way, he wrote the soundtrack to his life. He wrote the script. It was quite an amazing situation. Johnson had no problem stoking his own legend in his lifetime, but surely even he can't have imagined the fame and notoriety that his music and myth would receive in the decades following his death. His last words? "Take and hang this guitar on the wall, 'cause I done pass all that by. That's what got me messed up, mama. It's the devil's instrument, just like you said, and I don't want it no more." His life was a short one marred by struggle and tragedy, but his music was extraordinary, telling old tales in a new way. There's a purity to his music. Whether that came from a deal with the devil at the Crossroads or hard work and natural talent, you take your pick. I'm Dr. Ian Clarke, and you have been listening to Serious Rock Talk Crime. As always, the beat goes on.